Hi, good morning. I appreciate moderating this panel of very intelligent and on top of things folks who have a lot to say. The panel is about green business aviation, what we might be able to learn from Europe, and are people willing to pay to become sustainable and work toward that. So I'll let everyone introduce themselves and have a few opening remarks, and then we'll get going.
Shall I start? Okay, thanks, Molly. Hello, everyone. My name is Pooja Mahajan, and I'm the CEO of Azera, which is a company that was built from experience in business aviation and aviation in general to support the aviation community in sustainability and developing a sustainable action plan. I started my career at Pratt & Whitney Canada as an engineer, and followed by Bombardier, where I held several positions in product development, sales, and finally flight operations. And at some point, I ended up in Europe, and I was the CEO of Elitavia, which is a private aviation and charter company. And in that experience, I began to really face the challenges that operators are facing in dealing with a heavy emissions compliance burden. So this was sort of the seed for Azera. Azera is a tech and advisory company. We support companies to help them measure their emissions, whether they're an operator, FBO, MRO, or any company in the aviation ecosystem. We help them manage their compliance burden, reporting, et cetera, and also mitigation, so compliance allowances, SAF, and carbon credits. And we do that through advisory as well as digital solutions. So, digital solutions to enable the companies to do the work themselves. Thank you.
My name is Kennedy Rickey. Good morning, everybody. So I am the president of 4Air, and we offer voluntary programs that are kind of like sustainability by the hour, we like to call. So our whole goal was to make sustainability easy for operators, individuals, anyone in business aviation to get engaged with. And we noticed kind of the same thing that you did, that business aviation being such a nuanced industry required a nuanced approach to sustainability. So our goal was to build these very accessible, flexible programs that made it easy for people to participate. So tell us what you fly and how often you flew and how sustainable you want to be, and we take care of the rest. And so that's our voluntary side. We offer regulatory compliance as well. I think, as we'll talk about, the world continues to try to make it difficult, for business aviation operators, and much of that's coming from the environmental side. So how do we stay ahead of that? How do we help kind of drive, the regulations? It's going to come, but how do we make it make sense for us? And how do we make it easy for operators to stay engaged, to not get surprised by that? And then doing more and more work around sustainable aviation fuel, contrails, helping people to manage that, to report it, to track it. We'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. But basically, our goal was to make sustainability, easy for people to access.
Hi, I'm Mike Winston from CJI. I'm the chairman. We do two things. We operate aircraft, and we also make software. As the name implies, the software tends to focus on the classification and prediction abilities or predictive abilities of AI. We have two products along the lines of sustainability. One is called Dynaflight, and the other is called Link and Lander. So Link and Lander is basically a link you put into a trip sheet if you're a charter operator to allow your customer to buy carbon removal credits. And Dynaflight is a product really for corporate flight departments to track in detail and to be able to stand up under audit to purchase offsets and to track their emissions. We focus really on removal credits, not offset credits, which is carbon burial, which has a certain finality to it, because it's very difficult, we think today, to get a reliable standard that has not been politicized, or I guess is politicized in a way that even if you don't know if the standard is true, it sounds right. And that's kind of the best we can hope for at the moment. I think as time goes on and as more good work happens in this space, more people will understand what things like CORSIA are and what some other standards are. But for now, that's what we do, and that's who I am. Thanks.
Let's talk a little bit about the U.S. first. We know Europe is very different, but what are you seeing in the U.S.? Are more people voluntarily wanting to reduce their emissions? Or is there more interest? What is the situation right now?
Sure. I think, in Europe, we've seen an approach that's very mandate heavy, regulated. So we've seen a little bit, everybody has to comply with those mandates. It's been a little bit more broad, I think, of an approach. So people understand the importance of sustainability, but they're looking to the regulation as kind of the benchmark. Whereas in the US, we don't necessarily have, any kind of mandates that you have to follow. And so it's much more up to kind of the individual, the company, what they want to do. And so we'll see actually in the US, voluntary pushes go farther than we see kind of in the equivalent in Europe. More people engaged in Europe, but they're kind of looking to meet what the benchmark requires. Whereas in the US, I think we're seeing people willing to go farther and really kind of push and set their own benchmarks. And so in some ways, we actually see more engagement, I think, sometimes on the US side.
I'll add, in the US, a lot of the clients that are voluntarily compensating their emissions, measuring their emissions, publishing their emissions, they're public companies, publicly traded, and corporates that are looking to reduce their emissions or offset their emissions so they can demonstrate action. And they're often flying to international locations, particularly Europe, so they feel it's a responsibility. So there is a lot of leadership in the US on that side, on the voluntary side, that they're using it's more of a carrot approach in the US than a stick.
Yeah, one of the other big things that we've seen over the last few years is a big rise in emission disclosures. So, 4 years ago, about less than 50% of the Fortune 500 disclosed their emissions or reported them in some way. There's an effort, by the SEC to make it mandated that public companies do. That's currently kind of in a court challenge, but beyond that, the UK requires you to, the EU requires you to, California requires you to. So any serious kind of, multinational company or large organization is doing it already. And now we see about 99% of the Fortune 500 reporting their emissions. If you have a corporate aircraft, that is front and center to your emission disclosure. So it's bringing a little bit more transparency to the use of aircraft in a corporation. That's, we're seeing drive a lot of engagement by how do we show that we're, aligning our private aircraft with the company's goals, and even kind of incentivizing, what does that mean for the future of that corporate flight department? We are seeing a trend where people are trying to, maybe move to more charter or fractional because they don't want to show that aircraft kind of, it's a different bucket if you put it, if you own it directly versus charter or own via fractional. So we're seeing that transparency kind of have a dual impact of bringing a little bit more, action, I think, that corporate push, but also maybe changing the way that flight departments are going to look at their use of an aircraft.
Mike?
I mean, I think that, when we've dealt with corporate flight departments, we've run into the ESG person who is in some cases taken over because the company is buying so much offset or they already have kind of a mandate to do this. So it's sort of hit or miss in terms of, from a product standpoint, selling a specific offset or removal product to a corporate flight department. I mean, in broad terms, I think that the tax man cometh, that as soon as taxes come into play with respect to emissions, we're going to see not only the people who are voluntarily doing a lot of these things, dig in, but the people who kind of just to pretend like it doesn't exist. So I don't really welcome taxes, but I do think it's one of the ultimate, or probably going to be the dominant structure that wins as far as determining people's behavior.
This may be a good place to ask, this last election, what do you think will happen to, what kind of impact will that have on people's goals to sustainability and moving forward?
I think jets will burn coal on purpose. No, I'm kidding. I don't see much from the regulatory front at a macro level, but I'm sure my fellow panelists have other more specific thoughts.
I would say that obviously everyone's looking at the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a good stimulus for SAF production. But as I think it was Christy who said 2 days ago, a lot of these SAF producers are taking feedstock from farmers that are in Republican-led states. And so while the IRA may get disqualified in the short term, I think something will happen to ensure that SAF production continues. I'm not too worried about it, to be honest. And I think ultimately it's the US OEMs and producers and technology-driven innovators that are going to drive aviation forward. and it will ultimately be green, because that's the direction of more efficient operation, more efficient flight. I think back to SAF, if it's in the best interest of America to produce their own jet fuel, whether it's green or not. If it's a drop-in replacement for Jet A, it's still their own fuel. So I think there's a compelling argument there for things not to change dramatically, and for the OEMs are already invested in technology, as we've heard over the last 2 days. So maybe the timeline stretches, but I don't think the direction is changing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it took some kind of thinking through, but I think the biggest potential impact is around the IRA. There is a lot of support, kind of actually at a bipartisan level, I think, because of where those credits go. So we've kind of even seen, potentially if there's a rollback of the IRA, there might be a reintroduction of a new bill, I think, that would cover kind of SAF. Because it is, we focus a lot on kind of the environmental benefit of it, but there's other, what we call like co-benefits. So, there's a big jobs push behind that. It's domestic energy, it's energy security, energy stability behind it as well, because we're diversifying where that fuel can come from. So there's other, and actually one of the biggest supporters of SAF so far has been the military for the last 10, 15 years. So I think there's enough kind of momentum going on and other benefits behind what we're trying to do with SAF that will help kind of support it. Even worst case, if we didn't get something behind it, it just makes SAF more expensive. There's still other solutions like offsets, contrail management, the innovation pieces behind it. It's not like sustainability goes away with that. And I think at the same level, or the kind of similar mindset, sustainability is not going away anytime soon. We have to look kind of what's the next 10, 15 years of the industry, and this is an issue that only gets bigger and bigger. I think the real impacts of what we'll see is how we talk about it. I think as if we don't see kind of strong federal leadership or U.S. leadership behind sustainability, you're going to see the opposite voices probably get a little bit louder. So things like environmental protests, especially in Europe, we'll see probably more of those. I think that's been trending up over the last few years anyway. I think regulation of other countries, I think, is going to go up as well. We're seeing that again too. In the last kind of few weeks already, we've seen some of the states step up, their sustainability goals for next year. California notably made a major change to the LCFS. That's good for SAF. It'll help kind of bring pricing down and more competitive in California again. They're actually going to include jet fuel under the LCFS for the first time as well for any interstate flying. You've got the UK raising their air passenger duty tax on business jets. You've got France doing the same. And so I think that, regulation looking at making it harder. EU, we've got Refuel EU starting next year as well. And then kind of just came out with how you're going to comply with that back in September. So, this is just in the last 60 days of, regulation trends. I think you kind of see that more as well. So, that's kind of what I'd say, be prepared for, is that kind of conversation, that push for additional regulation, and probably, a little bit more state-by-state action in the U.S., because the states that have been strong supporters of this, which may surprise you, Nebraska, Texas, Illinois, Minnesota, there's actually been a lot of middle U.S. kind of push for SAF. You'll see more state incentives and probably a little bit, there was some momentum for some federal alignment on incentives. We probably, don't see that anymore. We'll see the states continue to lead the way on it. Europe had kind of a similar setup with this, where each country had their own SAF blending mandate and had, was very unaligned, unharmonized about what qualified and how much and what the value of those credits were. Refuel EU came in and just blanketed all of those, got rid of any of the country level ones, and harmonized what the requirement is in Europe. That would have been nice in the US. I think we probably don't see that. We see the continuation of this being a little bit more complex.
One question is, we do have a question. What is the proportion of carbon offset flights in business aviation? And related to that, I was wondering, is there a way to know how many fractional and charter operators offer that to their clients, and how many of those clients are doing it? Is there just a way to quantify it?
Looking at the whole industry, I think, is difficult because Part 91, and it's a little bit more challenging. But we did look at Part 91K and 135 flight hours, and about 18% of those were being offset already, and about another 5 to 10% were under an opt-in program. So that's showing about almost a quarter of our industry, has put sustainability either in the product automatically or has given the option for owners to participate of kind of our commercial side. I don't think you see that engagement in other industries. So that's something for us to be proud of. We've seen a really good initial engagement on this issue from commercial operators.
Yeah, I think from the European perspective, we've seen about 30% of charter operators and fractional operators as well, and private jet operators having some sort of program and offsetting their flights. It's very individual in terms of, from a business perspective, who's going to fully offset their flights. But we do have, I would say, a little bit under 10% of operators that are 100% offsetting their flights as a commitment. So they're doing that for themselves. At the end of the day, offsetting flights is not a very expensive enterprise. So as an example, if you take a Challenger, a mid-size aircraft, typically they emit about 3 tons per hour. And if you're looking for a high quality carbon credit, it's about $10, let's say $10 at the outside, $10 per ton. So for like a 3-hour flight, you're looking at under $100 to offset the flight. So it's really not expensive. Once you do the economics, charter operators start to see that, and then they start to embrace it because it's good for their brand, and it's good also for the environment.
That's a lot less than I was thinking. Yeah. Mike?
Yeah, for a removal credit, it's significantly more expensive because
That's true.
You're making biochar and you're burying the carbon. So it can be, if it's $50 a ton, which is very cheap for a removal credit, and it's 2.5 tons an hour, let's call it, because the average jet will do about 236 gallons an hour. This would be a little smaller than a Challenger. I mean, you're talking about $150 an hour, to $300 an hour, easy. So you really got to be committed. Where we find that people seem to be willing to do this are Hollywood customers. We're based in Vegas, so people who come from LA, they'll buy SAF and they'll buy removals, just so that they don't land and get Taylor Swifted, They've got something to say for themselves. But it's a tougher sell when you really start to add a significant part to the DOCs of an aircraft, which gets me back to the thought on tax,
Yeah.
So if you see them start to tinker with FET on charter, you see them start to tinker with, substantiate to me that you did removal on the flight. And if you can't substantiate that, then you'll get taxed. So, it's, the road to virtue is full of peril.
Still cheaper than the cost of catering.
True.
Did you know it's $6 for those? Sorry.
There's another question. Do you foresee any U.S. states drafting regulations to mandate offsets for flights into their airports or over their states, such as California or New York?
So I think this one gets fun because you get into, if anyone remembers constitutional law, the Interstate Commerce Clause, states are not allowed to regulate activity across states. That's the federal government's domain. So that's why what California just did with the LCFS is they're only including intrastate fossil jet. They can't tax or can't include interstate set fuel on that. The only one that we've seen so far is a potential mandate in Washington state that would require private aircraft to use 10% SAF, or really it's a requirement for fuel suppliers to supply 10% SAF at private aviation airports. I do potentially, see that one has not passed yet, but could potentially see more support for that. It's been drafted, and I think you might see other things like that, but probably not. I think just the U.S. is not, much of a mandate kind of culture. What we are seeing, though, a lot of is incentive taxes to use SAF or to produce SAF. So Illinois is probably the most notable one, that anybody who's paying use tax or sales tax on jet fuel, this is going to apply more to 135 or 91K operators. That fuel you can actually get a rebate on if you're using SAF. So the Illinois SAF use credit, there's a complicated way to go claim that, but that's 50 cents a gallon incentive to be using SAF, and that really helps bring the cost down on using SAF. That's in a substantial way. I think you'll see more opportunities like that, and so we're trying to look at ways we can take the Illinois model, apply it elsewhere. Minnesota's probably the next one. New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, the kind of Northeast corridor has been making some progress on adopting a clean fuel standard that would mirror what California is doing, something that New Mexico has also implemented already. It already exists in Oregon and Washington. So I do think you'll see more and more state programs emerge, but probably not as a mandate.
I think from international perspective, again, if you're flying internationally, then carbon credits end up being supported as a way to offset your emissions and be acknowledged in compliance schemes. So they are still a big factor, but that's outside of state mandate.
We were talking like earlier about young people, and where do you see the future going as far as embracing this? Will it take maybe the next generation? I know, like, my son changed jobs recently because he wanted to work for a company that was doing something positive for the environment, and he sought out a job like that. So, and he's, kind of the baby of the family, and I was proud of that. So is that, where did these kids go?
I can speak to that. I mean, there's a lot of concern about aviation and the future of aviation and bringing in talent and attracting talent. And I can personally say, having spent 30 years in aviation and now having Azera, I've never had a more excited group of young people work for me and work with me. And they actually fuel me to do more. And none of them had any desire coming in to work for aviation. They all had sustainability objectives in their minds, and they wanted to have a path and career in sustainability. I can honestly say that they all love and have developed a passion for aviation through the fact that we are bringing in innovation and that we have this sort of pathway to a more sustainable future. So it's very exciting for them, and I've never seen a more excited group. So I think that is just going to be the trend if we continue to innovate, if we continue, taking legislation aside, if we continue to work on things that are making aviation more efficient.
Yeah, I think if you look at the next generation, this is a top issue for them, and thinking about everything that they do. I think we always used to think about climate change as something kind of, to affect generations ahead or children of my children. That's not the case anymore. I mean, we're in it now. I think you're seeing weather isn't climate, but weather is a symptom of climate. And so you're seeing when you see more extreme storms or wildfires in New Jersey, or we had 70 days over 110 degrees in Arizona this past year, which is double the year prior. Those are symptoms of what's going on, and that's going to continue, and that keeps us top of mind for the younger generation who has serious conversations about, what changes they're going to make in their lives, including whether or not they're going to have children and what that means to bring people up. That's a real conversation, I think, going on. So this will really impact, I think, our workforce. We have to think about what it means for bringing in the next generation into the industry, both as customers, as the average age gets younger. One of the biggest customers we actually see is when a family office does a generational, transfer, then that younger generation comes in. They want to think about sustainability as their use of the families, what they invest in as a family office, and their use of an aircraft as a family. We've seen that some of our biggest commitments coming from that group. So this is affecting the customers, it's affecting the employees. One of the things that we do that was kind of more striking recently is we'll support our customers whenever they have the sales call with, a customer that they want to talk about sustainability, what's the operator doing, we'll come in and we'll help kind of guide that discussion. There was an email that one of the sales people we work with got, and said, I think, thank you for your email. I think flying private is one of the most immoral choices you could do. It's one of the biggest impacts somebody can have as they travel. And while I can afford to do it, out of a moral stance, I never will. And by the way, I think you have picked a terrible profession, and you should go look at take a look in the mirror, go look at another opportunity, and give me a call when you find a new job. I mean, that's a pretty striking email for a young sales rep to get. And how many of those do you get before you really do start to think about where am I as an individual? So that's a real conversation I think going on. It's hard in our industry when we know clients are very much at both ends of the spectrum on sustainability. When we sell to very different, customer priorities around this, but we have to be thinking about, that's a real customer conversation that's happening today and affecting our employees.
So Dynaflight was built by a guy who was 21 who we hired right out of school. It was his idea. And he said, he looked at what we were doing. He said, listen, guys, I love you, but, you have to do something here. And he did. He built this thing, and we promoted it and made it an enterprise class product. And, it is expensive. It is carbon burial. It's not carbon offsetting. And that's a problem economically, but we've stayed true to it. Can it do offsets? Yeah, it can, but we haven't flipped on that button. I think that, temperature, from what I can tell, is going up. in a spiraling upward and open like that. And that's a problem. It's dangerous. And I think that there's a tendency to debate the weather every year. But really, when you look at the trends over time, it's very difficult to say that it's not happening. I think that there are also two other things I'd point out. One is there are about 100 billion gallons of fuel burned. We need the petrochemical industry to be in charge of making SAF. And I was in Silicon Valley last week for a day, and I talked with some venture capitalists and learned about some of their incredible projects in SAF and the savings they're achieving. And they build the SAF plant, and it does 1 million gallons a year. So you really need the Royal Dutches, the big companies to put capital behind it. And they've got oceans of skilled engineers, and they know how to do it economically. And they will do it, I believe, economically. But it will take time. And so in between now and just using SAF, which kind of solves a lot of the problem, I think, depending upon the mixture of SAF in the tank, of course, there's important nuances. But in between now and the time that you get SAF, you get 150 billion gallons of SAF out there, let's call it, what do you do? And I think offsetting and removing and everything else you can do is what you do. But there's one thing not to lose sight of, and I think that that private aviation is a competitive tool. You still have to win. You can't sacrifice winning. You have to do other things so that you can continue to win. Do I really want, let's suppose we're averse to a country, let's pick China for example. Not that we necessarily are, we have a huge trading partner, but do you really want a supremely perfect private aviation network in China that makes them much more competitive than the United States? Or do you prefer to have a more competitive United States versus China? This is a national question, and I don't mean to wax political, but it is an unbelievable tool for growing our economy and improving our technology as we grow our economy. So, I think it's important that even though there's this burning, moral accusation that you can make, and there is some validity to it, to be sure, you need to save the baby. You don't need to throw it out with the bathwater.
Yeah, I'll just add, you mentioned something very interesting, which is about what to do now. And I agree with you, Mike, that and this is sort of where Europe comes in, right? Because Europe started talking about emissions and climate and back in 2005 when they introduced market-based measures, which is basically the EU ETS or emissions trading scheme. And in most countries in Europe, they have not only the EU ETS, they have carbon tax on top of it. And those are things that were implemented in 2016, 2012 we started. And what they've seen is a 40% reduction in emissions. So they're back to the 2005 levels. Now, yes, it's painful from a financial perspective, but it's working in terms of the objective, which is to keep the emissions down. And they've managed to do that through this EU ETS, which essentially what it does is it puts a cap on emissions for all heavy emitters in the region, and that cap comes down over time. And anybody that exceeds the threshold that they have has to pay for a compliance allowances, which is like a tax. And it works. It's working right now. And I'm not necessarily certain that it's keeping the industry competitive in Europe. When you add Refuel EU, which is requiring a 2% blend of SAF, I do think SAF is the solution. I do think technology is the solution, but as you say, we still have to work on doing things today.
I think, if you look at private aviation, I think there's always been an anti-private aviation sentiment and kind of movement to some regard. Environmental sustainability is kind of really a chink in our armor. And so I think we have to think about the sustainability of the industry itself. How do we continue to be financially sustainable, operate, maintain our kind of license to operate? I think safety is a really good kind of parallel. If we were unsafe, that would be a removal of our operating license. That would bring even more regulation in how we operate our aircraft. And sustainability is going to be a similar parallel, where it's going to become, and really in Europe has become much of our license to operate, because you have to comply with the emissions, the ETS rules, you have to comply with Refuel EU, or adding all of these kind of taxes that you have to comply with as an operator. This is part of our license, and we need to think about how we support operators in managing that, because some of these new fees I brought up, the ones in the last 60 days, for one of the operators we work with, that's $2.5 million of new taxes and fees. It's a major impact on their kind of their ability to operate and that, starts January 1. So they will waste no time in, telling you at the last minute, here's what you have to do, and it starts next year, and we'll send you an invoice if you fail, and there'll be 100% penalties on top of it. So it's important to stay ahead of this.
Yeah, exactly to your point. I mean, that's one of the things that we're trying to do, is to build tools that help manage risk, right? You have to monitor your emissions as you go along and be able to foresee the risk and the exposure that you're going to have. It's very complicated. Many operators in Europe are exposed to multiple schemes, so Refuel EU, EU ETS, Corsia, and it's not easy to manage on a spreadsheet. It doesn't work like that. So it is a whole other burden that operators have to take on. We've tried to automate that process, but it needs to be managed carefully, and you can manage your risk if you're tracking as you go, as opposed to let's calculate our emissions at year end and then
We've
get
got
that
about
2 million.
4 minutes to go. Why don't we do some quick fire questions, and then we'll get to you. Go ahead.
I just wanted to point out, I've often heard it said that private jet emissions are 2% of 2%, because the 2% of all emissions are aircraft, and then private aviation inside, that's about 2%. American Airlines does about 50 million tons a year. All of private aviation does 18 million. So we're much less than one major airline, but there is the patina of extravagance, a kind of waste, as if I sort of, not for dramatic effect, I suppose, but if I sort of took the top off and I just poured out the water on the floor, you'd say, what is he doing? That's kind of wasteful, right? And it doesn't really, it's not some irredeemable harm, but it's like, And I think that the problem that we face is one of impression, that someone is doing something wasteful or decadent or improper in some fundamental way, and it's not. It's a competitive tool, and a vitally important competitive tool. And I think one way in dealing with this question or dealing with these issues is to point out to people that it's first just much less. And then you can sort of separate and look at the ways to cope with what seems like bad behavior, but really isn't.
All right, real quickly, is there more concern around the SAF Grand Challenge being achieved or the IRA being diluted?
I think on the regulation side, you talked about the IRA a little bit. You probably, even if you had that get diluted or even repealed at some level, you probably have new support for SAF coming in. One of the concerns might be if you really try to defund the EPA or bring around reduction in some of the investment grants that we currently have, that would reduce our ability to build new plants and maybe reduce the incentives available at a federal level. But I think that's where you see, the kind of states, and it just means a lot of the production would, instead from being here and shipping it to Europe, will just be produced in Europe instead. So
Yeah,
I think if we want the fuel here, we should keep it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's always been the U.S. as having the carrot with the incentives from IRA, and therefore SAF production has been predominantly in the U.S. And now with Refuel EU mandating SAF volumes and also mandating that SAF be produced within Europe, I think that is also going to drive SAF production in Europe and maybe shift it to be accelerated if the IRA goes away, which I really don't think it's going to be completely dissolved.
All right, other than SAF and offsets, what non-fuel related green activities do you see business aviation companies doing?
The things we've seen is reducing kind of waste on board. How many forks are you pulling in for catering? What are other, how many water bottles are you using? And so corporate flight departments, that's become something. Starting next year, you have to monitor your contrail emissions in Europe. So if you've ever seen the white line behind an aircraft, that's a contrail. If it dissipates quickly, that's fine. If it stays and persists and grows and combines with other ones, that actually is a warming impact that can outpace the the warming impact from carbon emissions in aviation. And starting next year, we have to monitor that. So they're actually easy to avoid. Business aviation can usually fly above them, or in worst case, just kind of, usually you can fly above them in business aviation. So it's about knowing where they are, predicting where they are. That's something we've helped operators with, is start to implement contrail mitigation. So there are other opportunities, to reduce your footprint.
And I think, sorry, Mike, did you want to say something?
No, please go ahead.
Okay. I think that in general, whether you're part of the business ecosystem and you're not an operator, you can also begin. It begins with measuring your emissions. And it's so simple to do that, actually. And once you know sort of as a baseline of where you're at, you can begin to take action, right? And you'll begin to see the areas where, it could be business travel, it could be number of forks, it can be plastic bottles, it can be a variety of things in your operation, your day-to-day. It could be your energy source. But you have to look at it to actually start to begin to make those changes. And it's quite straightforward to do that.
So part of DynaFlight, it integrates with Flex if you use Flex, and it pulls in all your data of all your flights and all your tails. And then we've built into the AI, which is inside of DynaFlight, again, the corporate flight department software for offset that we've constructed. You can just ask the AI, what else can I do to conform with the NBAA flight department sustainability standards? And it'll tell you based upon your flight activity and your behavior. And those standards actually go beyond just emissions and SAF. So if you are a flight department looking for other things to do, you can use DynaFlight and it'll tell you.
All right, well, we've run out of time. Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you all.
Thank you.